Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to class. The essay topic that we're going to be discussing today is rather interesting. I don't need to remind you that we're going to be doing a few more essays from the Spectator. And you know that these essays have been written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. We're going to be doing another essay by Addison this time. And I'd like you to, while we are doing this essay, pay particular attention to the subject matter as well as the style in which Addison is writing. This is an essay that is very close to our hearts as students of literature, and you will see in a minute how close it is. You know that these essays were written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, and these are essays written on a variety of topics of concern and interest to people belonging to the aristocratic class. We've had a few essays before this, and they have focused on different aspects of life. Now the essays that you're going to be doing now are not essays that were published at the beginning of this entire series, which you know started on the 1st of March 1711. So the essay that I have chosen to discuss in class today is one that was published on Monday, the 3rd day of September 1711. And as you can see, the title that has been given is again a number. This is number 160. Previously, we've discussed the essays that were numbered 1 to 4. This time, we're making a big jump because I want you to read and to be able to comprehend and appreciate essays that have been written at a later date. March 1st was when Addison and Steele began publishing these essays, and the present essay was published in September. So when we come to this gap, we see a certain development in the style and a slight change in the subject matter of the essay. The last lesson that we did, Steele was informing his readers that he would be writing a lot about things that were of interest and concern to the women because they formed 50% of the population. This time, the essay that we are going to be discussing is about writing in general, and Addison is going to be dealing with different aspects of writing, particularly different genres of literature. So without further ado, let us launch into the essay and see what Addison has to tell us today. Of course, the beginning is with a quote in Latin. This time the quote is from Horace, and translated it means to judge fairly and impartially of the merits of foreign genius has in this age of exuberant patriotism become almost impossible. In other words, what Horace is trying to say is that genius is difficult to gauge, genius is difficult to measure, particularly when a genius in question happens to be by nature different from us. So it is foreign genius or its creativity or the outpourings of a mind that is removed geographically or linguistically. Okay, so let us come on to what Addison has for us today. And he says there's no character more frequently given to a writer than that of being a genius. Now, this word genius, according to Addison, is a word that is very frequently misused. It's misused, misappropriated. And in a minute, he's going to give us examples of how and where this term is misused. Right at the start, he says that there is no title that is given with more keenness, with more readiness than that of a genius. And we'll see how it is misappropriated and misused. I have heard many a little sonneteer called a fine genius. There is not an heroic scribbler in the nation that has not his admirers who think him a great genius. So you have a fine genius, a great genius. And as for your smatterers in tragedy, there is scarce a man among them who is not cried up by one or another for a prodigious genius. So you have three kinds of genius. It's not sufficient to call somebody a genius, but you must qualify genius also. So you have the fine genius, which is anyone who can rhyme, let's say, moon and June, or anyone who can write two lines that rhyme is called a fine genius. The heroic couplet is a form of verse which had a definite rhyme scheme. And Addison's comment here is anyone who can write a heroic couplet is termed as a great genius, because the heroic couplet has a certain rhyme scheme, a certain pattern in which it is written. So it was thought that, you know, it was a big deal to be able to write a heroic couplet. So he calls these people heroic scribblers. He doesn't call them poets at all. He doesn't call a person who can write a sonnet a poet. Poet is a category that Addison reserves for those who qualify being called a genius. And who those persons are, we're going to be finding out very soon. For the time being, there's three kinds of genius. There's the fine genius, and that is anyone who can write a sonnet. There's the great genius, that is anyone who can write a heroic couplet. And then he says, if a person can write a tragedy, a drama, he is called a prodigious genius. So the very height of genius, you would say that this is the superlative degree in the genius. And Addison has very strong dislike for the way that this word is misused, and not just misused but almost abused. So he says that there's no word, no term, no title that is given as frequently in our day and age, and he's talking about the 18th century, mind you, as that of genius. If you remember from what I told you in the very preliminary lectures related to the Spectator, I pointed out a couple of things, and one of these was that this was the time when there was an explosion of poetry, and particularly drama, and a lot of it was substandard. It couldn't really qualify being called drama at all, but because there was so much that was coming out and it was appreciated by the courtiers, the dramatists ended up by being given such titles. So now, having that as the background and seeing how Addison addresses this point, you have a clearer idea of the kind of poetry and drama that was being written. Anyone who could put two lines together was called a great genius. Anyone who could write a sonnet and rhyme, let's say 3 or 4 lines, was called a fine genius. And the person who could write a play was called a prodigious genius. So look at the superlative term that is being used. You don't even know whether it's going to be a successful play or not. You don't even know whether anyone is going to read it or not. It's enough that somebody has written it, 1 or 2 people have read it, and whoever reads it says, oh, this is genius, pure genius. That's not on according to Addison, okay? And let's deal with this topic in a little more detail. So in this paper, he says, my design is to consider what is properly a great genius and to throw some thoughts together on so uncommon a subject. So Addison, moving in the aristocratic circles, being a person who was considered a critic, aims to write about genius, to write about poetry and drama, and more importantly, what constitutes genius as far as poetry and drama are concerned. All right? So this is what he intends to do. Among great geniuses, those few draw the admiration of the world upon them and stand up as the prodigies of mankind, who by the mere strength of natural parts and without any assistance of arts or learning have produced works that were the delight of their own times and the wonder of posterity. So the first feature, the first characteristic that Addison points out to great genius is the fact that whatever was produced at the time it was produced, it was not only read but followed, and there was no assistance from arts or learning. There was no format that was given to them. If you think of the great epics, and in a while Addison is going to be discussing that also, you see that there was no format that was given to them. Now when you start to write poetry or you start to put a drama together, you are told that these are the rules that you have to follow. So those rules are assistance of arts and learning. No such assistance was required. Whatever was produced was a spontaneous overflow of feeling in the Wordsworthian sense, and it did not need assistance from rules and regulations. So these were works that were the delight of their times and the wonder of posterity. And it was not only in their own times that these plays and these poems were appreciated, but posterity, the coming generations, appreciated, admired these works as much as their own generations admired them, as much as they were admired and appreciated in the time in which these works were created. So that, according to Addison, is one of the features of genius. And he goes on for further detail, and he says, among these nobly wild and extravagant geniuses, what is the most beautiful thing is what the French call bel esprit, by which they would express a genius refined by conversation, reflection, and the reading of the most polite authors. So what were the rules? The rules were that whatever talent you had been born with was polished by discussion with your peers and seniors, and a lot of reflection or meditation or thinking, added to which you had the reading of the most polite authors. So you had to have a very strong knowledge base in order to create poetry and drama. In order to create great literature, you had to have a vast storehouse of knowledge to draw upon. So that's one of the features that are essential if you are to be considered a genius. The greatest genius which runs through the arts and sciences takes a kind of tincture from them and falls unavoidably into imitation. Now, he gives you a slightly different idea here, and he says that those people who are considered geniuses in this day and age, and mind you, Addison is talking about the 18th century. So in this day and age, in the 18th century, what is considered genius is a kind of reflection of great works. He says arts and science, in both categories, there is a slight reflection of work that was produced by the masters, by those who truly and completely, absolutely, totally deserve being called geniuses. Okay? So, the greatest genius which runs through the arts and science takes a kind of tincture from them. The greatest geniuses that you have now in this day and age, that is the 18th century, has taken or borrowed something from the great geniuses that you call the ancient sages. Many of these great natural geniuses that were never disciplined and broken by rules of art are to be found among the ancients, and in particular among those of the more eastern part of the world. And this is the more eastern parts of the world are Greece, and it's actually Greece that Addison is pointing towards. Homer has innumerable flights that Virgil was not able to reach, and in the Old Testament we find several passages more elevated and sublime than any in Homer. So there's no time bar, there's no timeline for genius. It could be amongst the ancients, it could also be amongst contemporary writers. True genius, according to Addison, has something in it that is not regulated by art, that's not regulated by rules and regulations. It's something that's spontaneous. It's an outpouring of that essential genius that forms the creative force within an individual. So he says that a lot of emphasis has been on the world as Europeans knew of it, but he says that you cannot say that all the genius was concentrated in Europe. You go farther east, you go as far as Greece, and you see that that is where you have the base of genius. And the base of genius he considers Homer and Homer's creations, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is what forms the crux of Addison's concept of genius. And then he says that there are some things that are sublime in Homer, there are other things that are sublime in the Old Testament of the Bible, and therefore you cannot restrict genius to any one time or place or person. It's something that is spread throughout history, it's spread throughout the world. So he says, at the same time that we allow a greater and more daring genius to the ancients, we must own that the greatest of them very much failed in, or if you will, that they were never very much above the nicety and correctness of the moderns. Now, so he makes a comparison. He has the moderns on one side and the ancients on the other. And he says that although we admit that the ancients were the true geniuses, he says that a lot of those geniuses did not take care of the rules and regulations that were implemented on the later generations. So when he makes a comparison of, let's say, Homer with something who was Addison's contemporary, he tells you that this is where Homer excelled and this is where the moderns are more careful on what is to be said and what is not to be said. And he gives you a few very funny examples from literature and from history which clarify this point that he brings out, and that says that, you know, contemporary writers are more careful about the feelings of people than these ancient geniuses were. Now you might wonder why they did not observe these niceties, or why they didn't observe appropriacy in their writings. One of the explanations that Addison himself gives here is the fact that they were above and beyond this. Another reason is that all these rules were made keeping in mind what those geniuses had created. Okay? All right. So in their similitudes and allusions, provided there was a likeness, they did not much trouble themselves about the decency of the comparison. So if there was the slightest similarity, they didn't worry whether it was appropriate to make the comparison or not. And this is where he gives you this example. So he says, Solomon resembles the nose of his beloved to the tower of Lebanon, which looketh towards Damascus. Now this is a very strange comparison. The nose of the beloved has been compared to many different things, but to compare it to the tower of Lebanon, which looks in the direction of Damascus or Syria, it doesn't give a very positive impression. It doesn't give me the impression, for example, that his beloved's nose was very beautiful. I have a tendency to think of a structure rather than a facial feature. So that's not to deny their greatness, but just as an example, Addison is pointing out that this is the kind of comparison that was made because the ancients did not observe the rules and regulations that the moderns are observing. So there was no emphasis on what was appropriate and what was not, and there was absolutely no consideration shown for anyone's feelings. So imagine being in the position of Solomon's beloved and having your nose compared to the Tower of Lebanon that looks towards Damascus. So you would have a nose that is not straight, but which is at an angle. So you'd have a nose that's sort of diagonal. Doesn't give me a positive impression of the nose of the beloved. I don't know about you people, but you know, it's a very strange comparison. So and Addison goes further and he says that just as the coming of a thief in the night is something that has been given you know, a comparison with the arrival of the beloved. And that's a very strange allusion. It's a very strange comparison, because on the one hand you have an individual who is welcome, and on the other hand you have a thief who is going away, who's stealing something from the house, and that's where you're making the comparison. So the ancients were above and beyond all these rules and regulations. They didn't have to stick to them. They didn't have to do things in a certain format. They were beyond all formats. And then he gives you another example, and this time again it is from Homer, and he says Homer shows one of his heroes so steadfast in battle that it's like an ass, like a donkey, who is being hit on all sides by young boys carrying sticks and stones, and he's not bothered. Now, on the one hand you have a hero, and remember, Homer's heroes were the 12 princes who later went on to rule their tiny states. Now these princes or kings are being compared to a donkey standing in a field, and all the boys in the village are throwing stones at it, beating it up with sticks. Is that what you want to compare your warriors to? Is that what you want your heroes to be compared to? Strange comparisons, but then Homer did it, and Homer got away with it. If you and I were to think of that, we would be termed as committing sacrilege. People would say, this is blasphemy. How can you bring in a hero and compare him to a donkey? So that's not done. But those rules are for us. Those rules are not for the great geniuses. And then that's one hero. There's one hero who is in battle, and who doesn't care how he is being hit, who doesn't care for the safety and security of his person. And there's another hero, and this time this hero has a fever, and this fever makes him toss to and fro in his bed, and it's like he is a piece of flesh. What do you call it? A boti. A boti that is being broiled on coals. Again, a very uncomfortable and discomforting comparison. You have a hero who is ill and who is in bed, and he's being compared to a piece of flesh, a piece of meat that is being broiled on coals, and that keeps on, you turn the sides, you turn the spit so that all sides are evenly heated and evenly cooked. So you have one hero who is the epitome of physical strength and courage, and you have another hero who has a fever and who's almost dying of the fever. So there's two sort of extremes that you show, the very strong on the one hand and the very weak. So this particular failure in the ancients, that is not sticking to niceness or appropriateness, opens a large field of raillery to the little wits who can laugh at an indecency but not relish the sublime in these sorts of writings. So the wits who are tiny wits, people who pretend that they are creating great literature, are very ready to point out these discrepancies in the writings of sages like Homer. And these people point out these shortcomings without thinking that a poet as great as Homer can get away with anything because of his genius. Okay? And then he gives a further example, and he says that the great emperor of Persia, the Shahanshah of Persia, amidst a great many pompous titles, denominates himself the son of glory and the nutmeg of delight. What a title! The son of glory, Arya Meher, son of the Aryans, son of glory. That is the title that the emperor gave himself. And it's not that this title has been given by the world. This is a title that he chooses to give himself. So on the one hand you have somebody like Homer, and on the other hand you have the Shah of Persia. Look at the comparison that is being made. The title given to Homer is considered to be less than the title that the emperor of Persia chooses to give to himself. It's not his people who have given it to him. He chooses to be known as the son of glory. So on the one hand you have a title that's been given by posterity, on the other hand you have a title that an emperor has given to himself. In short, particularly the ancients of the warmer climates, who have had to deal with the most heat and therefore life in their imaginations, we are to consider that the rule of observing what the French call appropriacy in an allusion has been found out of latter years and in the colder regions of the world, where we would make some amends for our want of force and spirit by scrupulous nicety and exactness in our compositions. So what he is trying to say is, Greece being a very warm country, whatever was produced there because of heat being the source of life, when it was transferred to colder climates or to Europe, it resulted in greater attention being paid to form and less to content. So what he's trying to say here is that in the 18th century what is being written has greater emphasis on the format, on the rules and regulations, on things like niceness and appropriacy, than on the content itself, than on the actual work. But there are exceptions. And the exception that Addison brings up is that of Shakespeare. And he says, Shakespeare is one person who was different. He came from a colder climate, but his genius cannot be doubted. Just as the genius of Pindar cannot be doubted. Pindar, the odes that he wrote were exceptional. They show his genius, and this is genius that cannot be replicated by those who are writing what are called Pindaric odes. Okay, so this is imitation. The originator is Pindar, just as Shakespeare had his genius in drama, Pindar had his genius in poetry. And in spite of the fact that Pindar was copied and imitated, the same effect was not produced. So can anything be more ridiculous than for a man to imitate a poet's fancy, a poet's way of writing, a poet's style? So, and this of course is a reference to the Pindaric odes. It says it's nonsensical, it should not be done, but it is being done all the time. So when I see people copying works as Horace has represented them, and are singular in their kind and inimitable. When I see men following irregularities by rule and by the little tricks of art, straining after the most unbounded flights of nature, I cannot but apply to them a certain passage in Terence. So he goes on the same theme, and he says that genius is something that is not replicated through imitation. Now here Addison is being very critical of the fact that in the 18th century the neoclassicists followed the great classics. They followed people like Homer, and they thought that they were writing the same as Homer if they followed Homer's format. What they did not realize was that they might be following the format, but they lacked the essential spark, they lacked that essential genius which made Homer's work great. So you could format everything, but you would still not get the same quality. So, in short, a modern Pindaric writer compared with Pindar is like a sister amongst the Camisards compared with Virgil's Sibyl, regarding whom Addison has further comments, and that is, there is the distortion, grimace and outward figure, but nothing of that divine impulse which raises the mind above itself and makes the sounds more than human. So the distortion, grimace and outward figure is there. The format is there. If it is a square that Homer is drawing, it's a square that is being drawn by the neoclassicists. But that does not mean that that square has the same divine impulse that Homer's square have. It might appear similar, but when you read it, when you study it, you see the flaws. It's very easy to see. Just because you have the same design doesn't mean you have the same genius. And that's the point that Addison is trying to emphasize here. And then he moves on and says there's another kind of genius which I shall place in a second class. So he's making different categories. And the second class, or the second category, he says, is not the same as the first category, and it's not that they are somehow their genius is of a lower category, but it's different. And what makes it different, what provides this distinction, is what he explains to you here. So in the second class of geniuses, he says there are those who have formed themselves by rules and submitted the greatness of their natural talents to the correctness and restraints of art. So in this second class, Addison puts Plato and Aristotle of the Greeks, Virgil and Tully in the Romans, and amongst the English he presents Milton and Sir Francis Bacon. How many of you remember the essays that we did by Francis Bacon? Good. We did a lot of essays, so you need to remember. So see, even Addison goes back to Francis Bacon and he calls him one of the great geniuses of English literature. So in this second category, he puts what you would say are geniuses belonging to a different category, no less than Homer, but a different class. And amongst these he puts Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, Tully, Milton and Francis Bacon. The genius in both these classes of author may be equally great but shows itself in a different manner. In the first, it is like a rich soil in a happy climate. It produces a whole wilderness of noble plants rising in 1,000 beautiful landscapes without any order or regularity. Beautiful comparisons Addison brings here from the world of nature. And what he compares Homer's work to is a wilderness of beauty. Plants and flowers that have sprouted in a very natural way, and there's a profusion of beauty, of smell, fragrances, of colors, and it's all, as they say, organically produced. That's the term that's very much used these days. So these are plants that are produced organically, and it says the landscape is beautiful because there's this profusion of color and fragrance. Okay, so this profusion of color and fragrance is not following any order or is not regularized. In the other, and that is Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, Tully, Milton, Bacon, in these, the same rich soil under the same happy climate is laid out in walks. So is beautifully landscaped. You have beautiful walks where people can, let's say, as they used to say, they can promenade, they can walk and appreciate the beauty around them. They can appreciate the fragrances, the colors, and the profusion of color and fragrance. The difference is that this is a garden that has been laid out by a gardener. So how is this garden different from the profusion of color and fragrance in the first example? The gardener uses his skills and landscapes the wild growth so that the grass is of a certain length and height only. The bushes are properly pruned. The trees are helped by support being lent to them, and they are also in their turn pruned to look more beautiful. So that beauty which in the first instance is the beauty of the profusion, in the second example becomes the beauty of order and method. The beauty is still there, the genius is still there, but in the second category the genius is pruned, is trimmed into a beautiful form, into a beautiful shape. That is the difference between the first category of writers and the second category. The great danger in the latter kind of genius is that the gardener might go a little too far in pruning and make the garden more symmetrical than beautiful. So if you form everything upon a model, you might lose in beauty what you gain in form. So if you, for example, stick very strictly to the unities of time, place and action in drama, you might not be able to produce the wonderful play that you would otherwise have produced. Okay, so there has to be a certain moderation that must be practiced. Imitation of the best authors is not to be compared with a good original. An imitation will stay an imitation. A copy, even if it is a certified true copy, will still be a copy. It will not be the original. And those of you who have been into submitting documents here, there and everywhere will know that in Pakistan at least, a certified true copy has to be attested. So you still have to go around looking for someone who will sign and stamp the certified true copy. So according to Addison, the imitation of the best authors is not to be compared with a good original. And he goes on to say that there are very few people whom you can say fulfill the criteria of true genius and are able to follow the forms that have been given also. It is odd to consider what great geniuses are sometimes thrown away upon trifles. And how are geniuses thrown away upon trifles? He says, I once saw a shepherd, and this is part of a story that's been related, who used to divert himself in his solitudes with tossing up eggs and catching them again without breaking them. So, a juggler, in which he had arrived at so great a degree of perfection that he would keep up 4 eggs at a time for several minutes. Where is the greatness there? The author says, I don't think I saw a greater severity than in this man's face. So the concentration of a man who is juggling 4 eggs at a time. He says, I have never seen a face so focused, so concentrated on the task in hand. For by his wonderful perseverance and application, he had contracted the seriousness and gravity of a privy councillor. And I could not but reflect with myself that the same assiduity and attention, had they been rightly applied, might have made him a greater mathematician than Archimedes. Now this juggler, the example that Addison brings in is that of juggling eggs. And he says, you know, he had this concentration, he had this focus on the task in hand. And it just makes Addison wonder if the same concentration had been applied to the study of something like math, that same juggler would have turned out to be a greater mathematician than Archimedes. So what he's trying to focus here is attention to detail, focus being on not what deserves it, but on something as silly as tossing eggs in the air. Where lies the greatness? Yes, it is a task which requires a lot of concentration. But what good is it going to do to humanity? How is it going to benefit mankind? If the same concentration, the same focus had been applied to something serious, something that would serve mankind, for example, the same juggler would have been able to achieve admirable results, would have been able to come up with something that would definitely have benefited mankind. Before we wind up the lecture today, let's quickly go over what Addison has discussed in this essay number 160 today. We've made a big jump from the essay that we were discussing in the last class. We have jumped in terms of time and in terms of topics. And this particular essay is focused on what is genius and the description of genius that has been given by the moderns, and by the moderns I mean the neoclassics in the 18th century, and how the same themes are taken by the neoclassics, the same format is taken, but what Addison feels very strongly about is that the same effect is not produced. And one of the reasons he gives for this is the fact that the format might be the same, that is, they're following the classics, they're following Homer, but the content, the subject matter, does not deserve being treated with the same seriousness of purpose. Let me give you one example. You know that Pope's Rape of the Lock is a mock epic. It has all the paraphernalia of an epic, but the subject matter is so trivial. It is of no importance at all. It is the cutting off of a lock of hair from the head of a beautiful woman. That is all that is done. And Alexander Pope presented it in such a manner that it had all the paraphernalia of an epic. It had its own version of the gods and goddesses. It had entire passages devoted to the description of a single object like a lock of hair or a pair of scissors or a box of powder or cream or rouge on the beautiful lady's table. So the same format was used, but the subject matter was trivial. So that's the kind of thing that Addison is referring to when he talks about the neoclassicists using the same format, using the same pattern and design, but being unable to come up with works that could rival or that could be compared to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So what Addison is focusing upon here is the fact that form is not everything. Form has to be substantiated, has to be complemented by content. And if there is no content, or if the content is not up to the same standard, then the work will not achieve that same greatness that is desired. And he winds up by giving this last example of a juggler who juggles 4 eggs at a time, and it's something that involves a lot of concentration. But Addison's point of view is that if the man had shown the same concentration and focus in his study of the sciences, he would have proved to be a greater mathematician than Archimedes. So by giving this comparison, what he is trying to present is that this focus, this precision, this undivided attention is misplaced. It's given to something that is as trivial as juggling, whereas there are far greater things that need to be focused on than the mere juggling of eggs. Thank you for your patience. Allah Hafiz. We'll meet again next time with another essay.